The silence from Marsha's phone stretched into its third day, and Trina knew with bone-deep certainty that something was terribly wrong. Her older sister had never gone more than 24 hours without responding to a text, let alone the dozens of increasingly frantic messages Trina had sent since Tuesday morning. The last communication had been a cheerful photo from Jakarta's airport, Marsha beaming beside a handsome Indonesian man, her eyes bright with the kind of happiness Trina hadn't seen in years. Now that photo felt like a cruel joke, frozen on Trina's phone screen as she sat in her Dallas apartment, paralyzed by dread and the growing realization that her sister's dream romance had become a nightmare. Marsha Langston had lived her entire 47 years in the careful, predictable rhythm of someone who had learned early that disappointment was easier to manage than hope. Her small apartment in North Dallas was pristine and sparse, filled with medical journals and mystery novels, but lacking the warm chaos of a life shared with others. Every morning at 6:15, she would tie her graying hair into a neat bun, pull on her hospital scrubs, and drive the same route to Presbyterian Hospital, where she had worked as a registered nurse for nearly 2 decades. Her colleagues respected her competence and reliability, but few knew her well enough to call her a friend. Marsha ate lunch alone, reading paperback thrillers or scrolling through her phone. She stayed late when the unit was short-staffed, covering shifts without complaint, then drove home to microwave dinners and television reruns. It was a life that felt safe but suffocating, like living underwater, peaceful but slowly drowning in its own predictability. The loneliness had crept up on her gradually. After their parents died in a car accident 5 years earlier, Trina had been her only regular human connection. Their weekly phone calls became the highlight of Marsha's routine, though she was careful never to let her younger sister know how much she depended on those conversations to feel tethered to the world. At night, when the hospital corridors grew quiet and her apartment felt like a tomb, Marsha would open her laptop and lose herself in social media. She created profiles on dating apps and international friendship sites, crafting a version of herself that seemed more interesting than the woman who spent her evenings organizing medical supplies and watching cooking shows she would never try. The rejection stung, but the hope of connection kept her scrolling, searching, posting carefully edited photos that hid the deep exhaustion in her eyes. It was on one of these restless evenings in February that Dimas Hario's message appeared in her inbox like an answer to prayers she hadn't dared to speak aloud. His profile showed a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and an easy smile, photographed against the backdrop of Indonesian temples and bustling markets. He described himself as a businessman who loved travel and was looking for someone genuine to share his adventures. His first message was simple but thoughtful, commenting on a photo she had posted of a sunset from the hospital parking lot. "You have an eye for beauty in unexpected places," he wrote. "That tells me you have a beautiful soul." Marsha read the message 3 times before responding, her heart hammering with a mixture of excitement and disbelief that someone so worldly would notice her. Their correspondence began tentatively, with Dimas sharing stories about his import business and his love for Jakarta's hidden restaurants and art galleries. He asked thoughtful questions about her work, expressing genuine admiration for healthcare workers and their dedication. Marsha found herself writing longer and longer responses, sharing details about her life she had never told anyone, her childhood dreams of traveling, her fear that she had wasted too many years playing it safe, her longing to matter to someone beyond her role as a reliable employee. Dimas was patient with her shyness, drawing her out with gentle humor and what seemed like genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings. He sent photos of places he wanted to show her, temples at sunrise, street food vendors, beaches with water so blue it looked artificial. "I keep imagining how much more beautiful these places would be with you beside me," he wrote, and Marsha felt something inside her chest that had been frozen for years begin to thaw. As weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened through hours-long video calls and constant text exchanges. Dimas remembered details about her shifts, asked about difficult patients, and celebrated her small victories. He seemed to see a version of herself that Marsha had forgotten existed, a woman capable of spontaneity and passion, deserving of romance and adventure. For the first time since high school, she found herself checking her reflection in mirrors, wondering if she was pretty enough, young enough, interesting enough for someone like him. The change was subtle but noticeable to those around her. Her coworkers commented that she seemed lighter, humming under her breath as she checked IVs and administered medications. She started wearing makeup to work again and bought new scrubs in colors that complemented her eyes. When pressed, she would blush and claim it was nothing, but late at night she would lie in bed rereading Demas's messages and imagining a future that seemed almost too wonderful to believe. Trina noticed the transformation during their weekly calls, hearing a warmth in her sister's voice that had been absent for years. When Marsha finally confessed about her online relationship, Trina felt a complex mixture of joy and worry. She wanted desperately for her sister to find happiness, but something about the situation felt fragile, too good to be true. "Just be careful," she found herself saying, hating how the words sounded like doubt when what she meant was love.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
When Demas invited Marsha to Jakarta in March, her first instinct was terror. The logistics seemed impossible. The expense, the time off work, the thousand ways the trip could go wrong. But as they talked through the details over video calls, his excitement proved contagious. He walked her through the airport, showed her the hotel he had booked, introduced her to friends via video, who welcomed her warmly in accented English. His face when he talked about finally holding her was so tender, so genuine, that Marsha's practical fears began to dissolve. She requested vacation time for the first time in 3 years, enduring her supervisor's surprised questions and her co-workers' good-natured teasing about her secret romance. The weeks before departure passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. She bought new clothes, researched Indonesian customs, and practiced basic phrases she found online. Every evening, she and Demas would plan their itinerary, his voice growing soft as he described walking with her through markets, introducing her to his favorite foods, showing her the beauty of his country through the eyes of someone who loved her. The night before her flight, Marsha met Trina for coffee, her nervous energy barely contained. She showed photos of Demas, their text conversations, the hotel reservation confirmations. Trina studied her sister's face, flushed with excitement and hope, and swallowed her lingering concerns. Marsha looked happier than she had in years, and maybe that was worth the risk. "Promise me you'll call as soon as you land," Trina said, hugging her tightly. "And if anything feels wrong, anything at all, you get out of there immediately." Marsha laughed, but her grip was just as tight. "I've never been this happy," she whispered. "I know it sounds crazy, but I feel like my real life is finally starting." April 5th dawned clear and bright, and Marsha arrived at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport 3 hours early, too excited to sleep. She sent Demas a selfie from the gate, her face radiant with anticipation. His response came immediately. "18 hours until I can hold you. I'm counting every minute." The 20-hour journey to Jakarta passed in a haze of movies and restless attempts at sleep. Marsha's phone buzzed constantly with messages from Demas, tracking her flights and expressing his growing excitement. By the time she cleared customs at Soekarno-Hatta International Airport, she was exhausted but giddy with nerves and jet lag. Demas was waiting exactly where he had promised, holding a small bouquet of tropical flowers and wearing the blue shirt he had shown her in their video calls. He was shorter than she had imagined, but just as handsome, with the same kind smile that had first caught her attention months earlier. When he wrapped her in a hug, she felt the last of her doubts evaporate. This was real. This was happening. Their first evening together exceeded every fantasy she had built during their long months of correspondence. He took her to a small restaurant overlooking the city lights, where they shared plates of food she had never tried and laughed at how strange it felt to finally be speaking face to face after thousands of text messages. Demas was attentive and charming, asking about her flight and sharing stories about the city sprawling below them. Back at the hotel, Marsha sent a quick message to Trina. "Landed safely, having the most amazing dinner. We'll call tomorrow with all the details. Love you." She attached a selfie of herself and Demas, both grinning over plates of Indonesian food, and felt a surge of triumph. She had done it, stepped outside her careful, controlled life, and into something beautiful and unknown. That night she fell asleep easier than she had in months, lulled by the sounds of Jakarta traffic and the presence of someone who seemed to genuinely care for her sleeping nearby. For the first time in years, the future felt bright with possibility. She woke to violence. The sound of splintering wood jolted Marsha from deep sleep, her mind struggling to process what was happening as masked figures burst through the hotel room door. She had perhaps 3 seconds of confused terror before rough hands seized her, covering her mouth and binding her wrists with professional efficiency. A blindfold plunged her world into darkness as voices spoke rapidly in Indonesian around her. Demas! She tried to scream through the gag, certain he was being attacked too, desperate to know if he was hurt. But there was no answer, no sounds of struggle from his side of the room, only the methodical movements of her captors and the terrifying realization that she was utterly, completely helpless. The next few hours passed in a nightmare blur of movement and muffled voices. She was bundled into what felt like a van, driven through streets she couldn't see to a destination she couldn't imagine. When they finally stopped and dragged her from the vehicle, the air smelled different, stale and damp, like a basement or warehouse. Her footsteps echoed on concrete as they led her downstairs and through what sounded like a heavy metal door. When they finally removed her blindfold, Marsha found herself in a dim underground room that reeked of fear and human misery. Other women sat against the walls, some Western, some Asian, all wearing the same expression of terrified resignation. Medical equipment lined shelves along one wall. IV bags, tubes, needles, and machines she recognized from her hospital work, but had never expected to see in a place like this. The truth hit her with sickening clarity as she noticed the needle marks on the other women's arms, the pale, drained look in their eyes. This wasn't about ransom or trafficking in the traditional sense. They were being harvested, kept alive, but systematically drained of their blood, their bodies treated like renewable resources by people who saw them as nothing more than walking blood banks. A man in surgical scrubs who spoke broken English confirmed her worst fears. They had been chosen specifically for their blood types, he explained with clinical detachment. Marsha's O-negative blood was particularly valuable, universal donor plasma that could command premium prices on the black market. They would keep her alive and relatively healthy, feeding her just enough to maintain her blood production while taking what they needed on a regular schedule. The other women's stories emerged in whispered fragments during the long, dark hours between blood draws. Sarah, a teacher from Australia, had been lured by a man she met while traveling in Thailand. Elena, a nursing student from Germany, had fallen for someone claiming to be a medical volunteer in Cambodia. Each had trusted someone who had sold them for a specific price based on their blood type and health profile. Days blended into weeks as Marsha's strength ebbed with each forced donation. She learned to sleep sitting up against the cold concrete wall, to ration the meager food they provided, to ignore the growing weakness in her limbs. The other women formed a grim sort of sisterhood, sharing what little comfort they could and clinging to increasingly fragile hopes of rescue. Meanwhile, in Dallas, Trina's worry had crystallized into action. The police had been sympathetic but limited in what they could do across international borders. Indonesian authorities claimed to be investigating but provided few updates and less hope. After 2 weeks of official channels producing nothing but bureaucratic delays, Trina emptied her savings account and booked a flight to Jakarta. The city overwhelmed her with its heat, noise, and sprawling complexity. She spoke no Indonesian and knew nothing about navigating a foreign legal system, but desperation had burned away her natural caution. At the local police station, she met Detective Suryadi, a middle-aged officer who had handled missing persons cases involving foreign nationals before. His English was careful but clear, his expression grave as he explained the challenges they faced. "Your sister's case, it fits pattern we have seen," he told her over coffee in the station's cramped break room. "Foreign women, lonely, meet men online who bring them here and then." He spread his hands helplessly. "We know it happens, but these people, they are very careful, very organized." For weeks, Trina haunted Jakarta's police stations, hospitals, and embassy offices, showing Marsha's photo and begging for help. She hired a local private investigator who spoke better English and had connections in less official circles. Slowly, they began to piece together information about the network that had taken her sister. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A former member of the trafficking ring, arrested on unrelated charges, offered information in exchange for reduced sentencing. He described a warehouse operation on the city's outskirts where foreign women were held for medical purposes. The description matched intelligence reports that had been gathering dust in police files for months. Detective Suriati organized the raid for a Tuesday night in late May, 7 weeks after Marsha's disappearance. Trina waited at the police station, her hands shaking as she drank cup after cup of bitter coffee and watched the clock crawl toward midnight. She had lived on hope and terror for so long that she could barely imagine what would happen if they actually found Marsha, or what it would mean if they didn't. The warehouse stood in an industrial district where legitimate businesses shut down at sunset, and shadows could hide any number of crimes. Police surrounded the building as teams prepared to breach the entrances. They had learned to expect resistance from these operations, which often employed armed guards and had escape routes planned in advance. The basement revealed a scene that would haunt the rescue teams for years afterward. 17 women from 8 different countries sat in various stages of physical deterioration, some too weak to stand without assistance. The medical equipment confirmed what investigators had suspected. This was a sophisticated blood farming operation that kept victims alive for months or years while systematically harvesting their blood for sale. Marsha was among the survivors, barely conscious but alive. She had lost nearly 30 pounds and showed signs of severe anemia and malnutrition, but her medical background had helped her understand what was happening to her body and how to preserve what strength she could. When the police lights hit her face, she looked up with eyes that had seen too much but still held recognition and relief. The rescue teams worked quickly to provide medical care and document evidence, while investigators traced the operation's connections. Financial records found in the warehouse revealed payments totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars, with individual victims valued based on their blood type, health status, and how long they were expected to survive the harvesting process. Dimas Hario's name appeared throughout the financial documents, along with bank account numbers and transaction records showing his payments for delivering specific victims. What investigators uncovered painted a picture of a man who had spent years perfecting his technique for identifying, grooming, and delivering vulnerable women to the trafficking network. His online presence had been carefully constructed to appear legitimate while concealing his true purpose. He maintained multiple social media profiles under different names, each crafted to appeal to different types of potential victims. His messages to Marsha had been copied and pasted to dozens of other women, with minor variations to make them seem personal and spontaneous. The investigation revealed that Dimas had been responsible for at least 12 confirmed kidnappings over a 3-year period, with victims from the United States, Canada, Australia, and several European countries. He was paid between $5,000 and $10,000 per victim, depending on their blood type and expected survival time in captivity. As the authorities closed in on him, Dimas attempted to flee the country using false identification documents. The manhunt involved multiple international agencies and lasted nearly a month before finally cornering him at a small airstrip outside Jakarta. When confronted by police, Dimas chose to fight rather than surrender, pulling a weapon and firing on the officers surrounding him. The gunfight was brief but decisive. Dimas died at the scene, taking with him any chance for his victims to confront him directly or understand fully why he had chosen to destroy so many lives for money. But his death also meant the end of his operation and the beginning of justice for the women he had betrayed. The documents found on his body led to a coordinated international operation that dismantled trafficking networks across Southeast Asia and rescued dozens of additional victims. Banks froze accounts connected to the blood trade, and several countries implemented new protections for citizens traveling abroad after online relationships. For Marsha, the road to recovery was long and complicated. The physical damage from months of forced blood donation required extensive medical treatment and nutritional rehabilitation. The psychological trauma ran deeper. The betrayal of trust, the weeks of terror, and the knowledge of how completely she had been manipulated left scars that would take years to heal. But she was alive, and she was free. In the Jakarta hospital, where she spent 3 weeks recovering, Trina rarely left her bedside. They talked through everything that had happened, The romance that had seemed so real, the vacation that had become a nightmare, and the weeks when neither of them knew if they would see each other again. I keep thinking about that last night in Dallas, Marsha said during one of their quiet conversations. How happy I was, how certain that I was finally going to have the life I'd been waiting for. It feels like that woman was someone else entirely. Trina squeezed her hand. She was someone who deserved love and happiness. That part wasn't wrong. You just trusted the wrong person. The other survivors became an unlikely support network, bound together by shared trauma, but also by their collective survival. They exchanged contact information and stayed in touch as they returned to their home countries, offering each other understanding that no one else could provide. Sarah, the teacher from Australia, started a foundation to educate people about online romance scams, targeting older women traveling alone. Elena, the German nursing student, testified before the European Parliament about the need for better international cooperation in fighting human trafficking. Each found ways to transform their survival into something meaningful, turning their pain into protection for others who might face similar dangers. The media coverage of the case was extensive, with headlines focusing on the international nature of the trafficking ring and the sophisticated methods used to target victims. But for Marsha, the attention felt surreal and overwhelming. She had survived something unimaginable, but she wasn't sure she was ready to become a symbol or spokesperson for anyone else. Back in Dallas, she returned to her apartment and her job at the hospital, though both felt strange and unfamiliar after everything that had happened. Her colleagues were supportive, but clearly uncomfortable, unsure how to interact with someone who had experienced such extreme trauma. Patients sometimes recognized her from news stories, leading to awkward conversations she hadn't expected to navigate. The legal proceedings continued for months as authorities worked to prosecute the surviving members of the trafficking network and pursue civil cases against the institutions that had enabled the operation. Marsha provided testimony and evidence, participating in the justice process while trying to rebuild her sense of safety and trust. The financial compensation from seized assets helped pay for her medical treatment and therapy, but no amount of money could restore what had been taken from her. She had learned that evil could wear a kind face and speak words of love, that her deepest desires could be weaponized against her, and that the world contained dangers she had never imagined. But she had also learned about her own strength, about the power of family loyalty, and about the dedication of people who risk their lives to save strangers. Detective Suryati stayed in touch, sending updates about the ongoing investigation and checking on her recovery. Trina moved to Dallas to be closer, understanding that their relationship had been forever changed by weeks when they might have lost each other entirely. A year after her rescue, Marsha stood in the cemetery where their parents were buried, placing flowers on their graves and thinking about the journey that had brought her to this moment. She was thinner than before, more cautious in her interactions with strangers, and careful about sharing personal information online. But she was alive, and she was surrounded by people who loved her. The other women from the warehouse had all found different ways to process their experiences. Some retreated from public attention and focused on private healing. Others became advocates and educators, working to prevent similar crimes. A few struggled with depression and post-traumatic stress that required ongoing professional help. Marsha chose a middle path. She returned to nursing but requested a transfer to the trauma unit, where her own experience with survival helped her connect with patients facing their own life-threatening situations. She spoke occasionally at conferences about online safety, sharing her story as a warning to others, but always emphasizing that the fault lay with the predators, not their victims. 2 years after Jakarta, she received a letter from Detective Suryati informing her that the last members of the trafficking network had been sentenced to life in prison. The warehouses had been demolished, the equipment destroyed, and the bank accounts permanently seized. The investigation was officially closed, with 17 women rescued and dozens more potentially saved by the network's destruction. Justice had been served, though not in the way anyone would have chosen. Demas would never face trial or explain his actions to the people he had hurt. The victims would never get the satisfaction of confronting their tormentor or hearing him admit what he had done. But his operation was finished, his co-conspirators were imprisoned, and the women he had tried to destroy were building new lives in freedom. On quiet evenings, Marsha sometimes thought about the woman who had boarded that plane to Jakarta with such hope and excitement. She mourned for that version of herself, the trusting nurse who believed in fairy tale romances and happy endings. But she also felt grateful for the strength she had discovered in darkness, the support system that had refused to give up on her, and the knowledge that she had survived something designed to break her completely. The story of her kidnapping and rescue had touched thousands of people around the world, inspiring increased awareness of online predators and international trafficking networks. Law enforcement agencies had improved their cooperation and response protocols. Advocacy groups had secured better resources for survivors. Travel safety education had been enhanced to include information about romance scams and trafficking warning signs. Most importantly, 17 women who might have died in that basement had lived to see their families again. They had returned to careers and relationships, to dreams interrupted but not destroyed by their captivity. They had proven that even the most carefully planned evil could be defeated by persistence, courage, and the refusal to give up hope. Standing in her apartment 3 years later, Marsha looked at the photos on her mantelpiece. Pictures of her parents, of Trina's wedding, of the nursing unit team at the hospital. They were images of a life rebuilt from trauma, relationships that had deepened through adversity, and purposes discovered in the aftermath of near destruction. She had learned to be cautious without becoming cynical, to protect herself without closing off from human connection entirely. The romantic dreams of her 40s had been replaced by more modest, but perhaps more meaningful goals. Doing work that mattered, maintaining relationships that sustained her, and finding peace in the simple fact of her continued existence. Justice for Marsha and the other survivors hadn't come in the form of a courtroom confrontation or a satisfying explanation for why they had been targeted. It had come through their collective survival, their mutual support, and their determination to transform their experiences into protection for others who might face similar dangers. The trafficking network that had seemed so powerful and untouchable had been completely dismantled. Its leaders were imprisoned or dead, its operations shut down, its victims free to reclaim their lives. In the end, evil had been defeated not by revenge or retribution, but by the simple, persistent refusal of good people to let it win. That victory belonged to every person who had refused to give up the search, who had followed evidence wherever it led, who had risked their safety to save strangers, and who had chosen to rebuild rather than be broken by trauma. It belonged to Marsha, who had survived months of horror and emerged with her humanity intact, and to Trina, who had traveled to the ends of the earth to bring her sister home. Most of all, it belonged to the knowledge that somewhere in the world, women were safer because of what had been endured and overcome in that Jakarta warehouse. The price had been terrible, but the victory was real, and it would protect people whose names would never be known and whose stories would never be told. In a world that often seemed tilted toward cruelty and exploitation, 17 women had been given their lives back, and countless others had been spared similar fates. Justice had been served in the most meaningful way possible, through survival, recovery, and the absolute defeat of those who had tried to reduce human beings to mere commodities. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about the dangers lurking behind romantic promises and too good to be true opportunities, please hit that like button to help others find this important message. And don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories that reveal both the darkness people are capable of and the incredible strength of those who refuse to let evil win. Your engagement helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them most. Because knowledge truly is the best protection against predators who count on our trust and isolation to succeed.